In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba. This marked the beginning of a new era for the island nation, one that would be defined by radical changes and intense geopolitical struggles. He overthrew the dictator Fulgencio Batista, who was seen as a U.S. puppet. Batista's regime had been marked by corruption, inequality, and a close relationship with American business interests, which many Cubans deeply resented. Castro's revolution promised social justice and an end to American influence. The streets of Havana were filled with jubilant crowds celebrating the promise of a new beginning, one that would prioritize the needs of the Cuban people over foreign interests. The U.S., initially hopeful about Castro, grew wary as he nationalized industries and cozied up to the Soviet Union. American businesses lost their holdings, and the political landscape of the Caribbean began to shift dramatically. This shift in alliances set the stage for a dangerous confrontation. The Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union now had a new, volatile front right in America's backyard. Castro's policies, particularly land redistribution, alarmed the U.S. government. Large estates were broken up and redistributed to peasants, which threatened the interests of American landowners and investors. They feared the spread of communism in the Caribbean, right on America's doorstep. The proximity of Cuba to the U.S. mainland made the situation even more precarious, heightening fears of a domino effect in the region. The U.S. began to exert pressure, hoping to topple Castro's regime. Economic sanctions were imposed, aiming to cripple the Cuban economy and create discontent among the population. This included economic sanctions and covert operations. The CIA orchestrated various missions to undermine Castro's government, but these efforts only served to strengthen his resolve. These actions only pushed Cuba further into the arms of the Soviet Union, setting the stage for a major crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis would soon bring the world to the brink of nuclear war, forever altering the course of history. In 1961, the U.S. attempted to overthrow Castro in a disastrous operation known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA trained and equipped a force of Cuban exiles to invade the island and spark an uprising. However, the invasion was poorly planned and executed. It ended in a humiliating defeat for the U.S. and strengthened Castro's grip on power. The Bay of Pigs was a major turning point. It solidified Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union. Feeling vulnerable after the invasion, Castro turned to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev for protection. Khrushchev, eager to exploit this opportunity to gain a strategic advantage over the U.S., agreed to provide military aid. This included sending nuclear missiles to Cuba. From the Soviet perspective, placing nuclear missiles in Cuba was a strategic masterstroke. It would help offset the U.S. advantage in long-range nuclear weapons. The U.S. had missiles in Turkey and Western Europe that could strike the Soviet Union. Placing missiles in Cuba would give the Soviets a similar capability to strike the U.S. mainland. Khrushchev also believed that the move would deter a potential U.S. invasion of Cuba. The presence of Soviet troops and nuclear weapons, he reasoned, would make the U.S. think twice about attacking the island. The Soviets began secretly shipping missiles and building launch sites in Cuba in the summer of 1962. In October 1962, U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviet missile sites through aerial reconnaissance photographs. The news sent shockwaves through the Kennedy administration. Having nuclear missiles just 90 miles from Florida was unthinkable. The U.S. felt deeply threatened and feared a surprise attack. The discovery plunged the world into a state of fear and uncertainty. Kennedy faced a grave dilemma. A direct military strike against Cuba was considered, but this carried the huge risk of Soviet retaliation and all-out nuclear war. Other options included diplomacy, a naval blockade of Cuba, or a combination of approaches. The world held its breath as the two superpowers stared each other down. Section 5. Kennedy's Gamble, the Naval Blockade. President Kennedy opted for what he called a quarantine of Cuba. This was a naval blockade in all but name. U.S. warships would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba and turn back those carrying offensive weapons. The blockade began on October 22, 1962. It was a risky move that brought the two superpowers to the brink of war. The world watched with bated breath as Soviet ships approached the blockade line. The tension was palpable. In the U.S., citizens prepared for the worst, stocking up on supplies and building bomb shelters. The threat of nuclear annihilation had never felt so real. Section 6. 13 Days of Terror, Finding a Way Out. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it came to be known, lasted for 13 agonizing days. During this time, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in tense negotiations, primarily through diplomatic channels and back channels. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged letters and messages trying to find a peaceful resolution. The threat of nuclear war loomed large. Finally, on October 28, a breakthrough was achieved. Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States pledged not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over, and the world heaved a collective sigh of relief. Section 7. A Safer World? The Hotline and Testban Treaty. These two initiatives were pivotal in shaping a new era of cautious diplomacy during the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound impact on global politics. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, and the tension was palpable. Leaders and citizens alike realized the catastrophic potential of nuclear conflict. It underscored the terrible dangers of nuclear war and the need for clear communication between superpowers. The fear of mutual destruction led to a pressing need for more reliable and immediate communication channels. One direct outcome was the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow. This was not just a symbolic gesture, but a practical tool designed to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to escalation. This red telephone would allow the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union to communicate directly and quickly during future crises, hopefully preventing misunderstandings and escalation. The hotline was a crucial step in ensuring that both superpowers could discuss and defuse potential threats in real time. In 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union also signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. This treaty was a landmark agreement in the history of arms control. This treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. It was a significant move towards curbing the nuclear arms race and reducing the environmental damage caused by nuclear tests. While it did not end the arms race, it was a significant step towards reducing nuclear proliferation and limiting the devastating environmental effects of nuclear testing. The treaty represented a mutual acknowledgement of the need to protect the planet and its inhabitants from the horrors of nuclear fallout. It was a hopeful sign that even in the darkest times, diplomacy and cooperation could pave the way for a safer world. Section 8. The arms race rumbles on. Despite these efforts towards détente, the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union continued throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. The world watched as these two superpowers engaged in a relentless competition to outdo each other in nuclear capabilities. Both sides poured vast resources into developing new and more powerful weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, which had the capability to deliver nuclear warheads across continents with devastating accuracy, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs. These underwater-launched missiles added a new dimension to the nuclear threat, making it even harder to detect and defend against potential attacks. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, commonly known as MAD, prevailed, creating a precarious balance of power. This doctrine was based on the idea that any nuclear attack by one superpower would result in an equally devastating retaliation by the other, ensuring mutual destruction. With each side knowing that any nuclear attack would be met with devastating retaliation, the world lived under the constant threat of annihilation. This tense standoff defined the Cold War era. The Cold War rivalry extended beyond nuclear weapons to conventional forces, space exploration, and technological advancements. Both nations sought to demonstrate their superiority in every possible arena, and proxy wars in various parts of the world. These conflicts often served as battlegrounds for the superpowers to exert their influence without engaging in direct confrontation. The two superpowers competed for influence in Africa, where they supported different factions and governments to gain strategic advantages. Asia, where the Vietnam War became a significant flashpoint, and Latin America, where numerous coups and revolutions were influenced by the superpowers' interventions, often supporting opposing sides in regional conflicts. This global struggle for dominance shaped international relations and left a lasting impact on the world. Section 9. Conclusion. Living with the bomb. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. It showed how quickly miscalculation and mistrust could lead to the brink of catastrophe. While the crisis ultimately led to some positive developments in United States-Soviet relations, it also highlighted the enduring tensions and risks of the Cold War. The legacy of the crisis continues to shape international relations today as nations grapple with the challenges of nuclear proliferation and the threat of nuclear terrorism.